From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you up to date on the news that made headlines in our region this last week. And today, our panel includes James Dawson with Boise State Public Radio, Dawn Day, the founder and editor of BoiseDev.com, Kyle Fonenstill, reporter for Idaho Capital Sun, and Kevin Fixler, investigative reporter with the Idaho Statesman. And today we're beginning with a high-profile murder trial that will begin in Boise in just about 3 months, as Brian Koberger is accused of killing 4 University of Idaho students 18 months ago. Now, before the trial begins, there have been numerous court hearings. In fact, one earlier this week lasted 7 hours, and Kevin Fixler was in the courtroom that entire time, and he's joining us now to break down that hearing. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
So, Kevin, can we just begin with why this hearing was called in the first place? And we should note, a high-profile attorney just joined the prosecution's team.
Sure. So essentially, we're at the point of the pretrial stage where we're establishing the ground rules for how the trial will go. You might consider this sort of the rules of engagement that prosecutors and the defense have to abide by per Idaho court rules. We've seen things like attempts to strike the death penalty, motions back and forth over various pieces of evidence that could be admissible, those sorts of things. And then we're also still establishing, or at least at this point, have gotten to the point of confirming who will be members of each legal team. We've seen some swap outs of attorneys, and it looks like we've reached kind of the final stage of that. And the person who just joined the prosecution is former U.S. Attorney for Idaho, Josh Hurwitz, an appointed position by the president. He left that position in February on account of the transition to the Trump administration. It's a political appointment, and he is now signed on as a deputy prosecuting attorney through Latah County Prosecutor's Office.
So during the 7-hour hearing, there were numerous motions made with the judge, Stephen Hippler, making decisions on some. Now, while other times he did not make a ruling, which I believe he basically says acted as a de facto order, he did say that he would hold both sides to existing criminal court rules and standards. So, Kevin, let's start with those bench orders. First, explain briefly for folks what a bench order is.
It's pretty self-explanatory just by the name itself, but it's where a judge rules from the bench. And so inside the courtroom, a spoken ruling rather than a written order, which is something that can come later, that includes justifications in writing. And so Judge Hippler in this situation, sort of surprisingly, because his history in this case is not to issue bench orders, but he did dictate some of those in court on Wednesday.
Okay, so I want to go through those because my understanding is, Kevin, there were 4 bench orders from Judge Hippler. So tell us about one order that had to do with data from Amazon.
So last month, we learned through a pretty significant court filing from the state. They alleged that Brian Koberger purchased the same brand of knife and a leather sheath accompanying it, as well as a knife sharpener, as that believed to be the murder weapon in the homicides in Moscow of the 4 students. Beyond that, they actually say that they can prove, based on this data that they obtained through search warrant, that Brian Koberger also was searching for the same knife and the same sheath after the crime. And that's relevant because, at least according to the state and their theory of the case, that the knife sheath was left behind, which was discovered at the crime scene, and is sort of the focal point of evidence that we know about thus far, because the state alleges that it has Brian Koberger's DNA on it. And that's really how ultimately they came to locate him. As far as we know, a murder weapon was never established or discovered by the state. And so, again, according to the state's theory, it was, dumped, what have you. And so perhaps Koberger was searching for the same item to state to folks that, look, I still own these items. It wasn't me.
Okay, so then there was an order in regards to a traffic stop video.
hmm This was interesting because Brian Koberger, as anyone following this case knows, there's been body cam footage released of various traffic stops
Hmm.
throughout the history of the case. Koberger had driven with his father cross country and was stopped twice back to back in Indiana over the course of 10 minutes. And we've all sort of seen that footage released through public records requests and so forth. There was another stop that he was involved in for running a red light on the WSU campus in Pullman, where he was attending school. So we've seen those things, but this was actually the traffic stop we've not seen. It's yet to be released, and it's been denied through public records by the Lake County Sheriff's Office on accounts of they believed it might prejudice him for trial. And so in this traffic stop, which was he was pulled over for a seatbelt violation in August of 2022, so several months before the November 22 homicides. Uh,
Hmm.
and the state is attempting to use this information to show the jury, hey, look, he owned this vehicle. We can positively ID that this is in fact Brian Koberger sitting in the courtroom, and he also gave his phone number. All of those things are important to show how they establish search warrants and including for his cell phone data. The defense has argued that this is prejudicial information because of some dialogue he had back and forth with the deputy who pulled him over, basically questioning why the deputy would need his photo ID and his phone number. And they were concerned that it could show that Koberger perhaps was skeptical of police or, engaged in banter that may make the jury have certain emotions or feelings about him. Ultimately, Judge Hippler decided that the video should be included. It can be admissible by the state for the purposes that they laid out. And yet, he did say that he would consider redacting some of that banter so as just to allow the state to establish what they want, but not also prejudice Koberger.
Hmm. So, Kevin, tell us about the prosecution wanting to use a physical 3D model of the home where the killings happened. What did the judge decide on this?
The four students lived at a pretty unique home in Moscow, just off campus, and that was where their bodies were found. And three-story property, and the individuals were found on different floors. Uh, Again, pretty unorthodox property. The state suggested they want to provide an exhibit for demonstration purposes only. So various witnesses can point out where they either found the bodies or various pieces of evidence in the home. Uh, but this came as a bit of a surprise to the defense, is sort of in their counter filing objecting to this. What it is it's a model that will be constructed by the FBI, and we're not talking about something small here. We did get the
Hmm.
dimensions the other day in court. It's about 4 feet tall, and it would basically live in the courtroom for people to point out various sight lines, where they were at certain points, including the two surviving roommates who are expected to testify at trial. And again, it's
Hmm.
for demonstration purposes only, but the defense had argued that they didn't get enough information about this early in. They pointed out that the home uh, had been razed, and so they don't have opportunities to kind of review whether or not the sight lines are correct, or if one of the witnesses couldn't see from a certain angle. They put up quite a fight about this, arguing about constitutional rights for Koberger, but Judge Hippler decided that it can be used, but it is not something that the jury can take back with them during deliberations beyond just seeing how witnesses point out certain aspects of the crime scene.
Okay, that's an interesting point. All right, and then the other bench order, Kevin, had to do with Brian Koberger having autism.
Right. So, in other recent filings from the defense, they have pointed out that Brian Koberger has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and
Hmm.
they are it became an issue about whether or not prosecutors could basically use that if Koberger is convicted by the jury, whether or not they can use what is a neurological disorder rather than a mental health issue to justify the death penalty to the jury. The state said that they never had intentions of doing so, but they were instructed specifically by Judge Hippler not to go ahead and use that. What was interesting in this back and forth was that Deputy Attorney General Jeff Nye, who's part of the prosecution, actually said, this was never part of our plan. And frankly, we have a lot better aggravating evidence for Koberger if he is found guilty.
Hmm. Okay, so Kevin, I know there were upwards of 10 issues that the judge did not rule on, which would mean that they will stay status quo. We don't have time to go into all 10, but is there one or two that stood out to you?
Essentially, Judge Hippler said the standard rules of court would apply for these particular items that were filed one way or the other. One was about inflammatory evidence, which could be, graphic crime scene photos. The defense doesn't want a multitude of those types of things as one. The defense also can't say that the state is trying to kill their client. Those were two minor ones. The ones that I would really zero in on are that the state can't, or excuse me, the defense can't say that the state illegally obtained some cell phone tower data related to Koberger
Hmm.
from AT&T. That hasn't been established. And then the one that I think people are clued in on is about the alleged alibi from Brian Koberger, that he was not in the area of the home in Moscow at the time, but was in fact driving around alone. But he has never established any sort of corroboration about that. Prosecutors want uh, Koberger to testify if that's going to be what he said. The defense says they have partial corroboration, in quotes, from a cell phone tower expert, but nobody at this point can say where Koberger was at that time because his cell phone was off during the time of the murders.
And there were 9 motions during this 7-hour hearing that the judge took under advisement. So, again, Kevin, what stood out to you in those motions that he's taking under advisement?
One of the surviving roommates in the home happened, an eyewitness saw somebody, a man dressed in all black, about 6 feet tall or so, and wearing basically a balaclava, is what she has said. But the key characteristic that came out of what she has repeatedly told police is that the man had bushy eyebrows. This has become a debate whether or not Koberger actually has bushy eyebrows, but it's a question on whether or not she will be able to testify to that specific description. And that is one where Judge Hippler took that under advisement. Two others that I think are particularly interesting are two additional attempts by the defense to prevent a potential death sentence if
Hmm.
Koberger is convicted, one of which is related to his autism spectrum disorder. That would set new U.S. Supreme Court precedent if that was actually the direction that Judge Hippler were to go, and almost certainly would be challenged up the line. The other is for people who are familiar with the Lori Vallow Daybell case. It's about alleged violations of the state turning over evidence on time, including expert lists. Um,
Hmm.
and so they're basically arguing that the defense cannot provide effective counsel because they've been delayed in receiving pieces of information from the state on time.
So, Kevin, before I let you go, what's next? Because I do know that the start of the trial, jury selection begins what, July 30th?
That's right. Yeah, before we get to that point, actually, we are still going through the jury questionnaire
Hmm.
portions. None of that is public. They were actually supposed to have a closed door hearing next week, but I think that may get bumped. Uh, they're going back and forth on solidifying that between the two sides plus the judge. There's some other upcoming deadlines, including exhibit lists that have to go back and forth between the two sides and be submitted to Hippler. Also, which lay witnesses will be testifying, or are the hopes from both sides. But there is a hearing next month. It's the final pretrial hearing scheduled for May 15th, could carry over to the 16th if need be. So I think we're expecting another pretty long day. But as you pointed to, we have jury selection scheduled for July 30th. And then the 3-month trial is slated for August 11th. Those interested can go to idahostatesman.com. Myself and my colleague Alex Brizzi are covering it closely and will continue to do so.
And we will, of course, come to you, Kevin, when there are updates. Really appreciate you taking time to go through all of this with us today. It was 2 weeks later than planned, but the Idaho legislative session did wrap up last week. And Jimmy, you were at the State House almost every day of the session. So, how would you describe this year's session?
Oh boy, I'm still coming to terms with it, Gemma. I would say that probably a good way to describe it is that we talked about this a lot last year and kind of leading up to the session, but there were significant changes from last year's primary and general elections. So I think that you had a lot of new people there. who weren't really afraid to speak their minds. And this is kind of a trend that's been going back a few years now, because, this was before my time, but everything I ever heard from people like Betsy Russell or, some people who had been around a very long time were saying that, freshman lawmakers traditionally would be put on committee. They were told, sit down, shut up, and vote how we want you to, and don't make noise. Maybe we'll let you introduce a bill. And that's not what we saw at all this year. You had a lot of freshmen coming up with bills, or people who had been around maybe a year or two. You had, lots of debate in committees and on the floors from a lot of these freshmen who were generally much more conservative than the people that they beat out in the primaries, their Republican opponents in last year's primary. So that was kind of a flavor. At times things got pretty heated and testy. That doesn't, that happens sometimes, but I would say that this year in particular, there were maybe some more moments than we've seen in the last 3 years.
And Jimmy and Kyle, I know you both were following the medical freedom bill that was keeping this session from wrapping up. So Jimmy, let's start with you. And can you tell us about the bill and maybe begin with the governor vetoing a version of this bill, just a week or two ago, right?
Yeah. So the original version that got vetoed. So what I'm about to say is not what was passed into law, but it's very similar. So what the governor vetoed was essentially a largely, broad bill that would make it so private businesses, public and private schools, and government entities could not refuse service to anyone who didn't treat any sort of illness that they might have had. It basically took over what was, current law, which is basically banning those sorts of quote unquote discriminations for anyone who didn't get a COVID-19 vaccine. That law was passed a couple years ago, but it changed coronavirus vaccine to medical treatment, which includes any sort of diagnostic tool or test, any sort of vaccine, of course, or any other way that you're treating an illness, basically. And so that's what the governor vetoed in his veto letter. Said, this is pretty broad. I especially don't like that it applies to schools. I don't want to see kids coming to school with lice or any sort of, significant illness that is treatable, and parents having to adapt to that in the name of someone else's medical freedom.
Okay, so Jimmy, lawmakers then brought a new version forward after this veto. So how different was it from the original bill that the governor vetoed?
Not very different. The main difference is that they put in a couple references to other Idaho statutes, basically saying that schools could tell a student or a parent that, hey, we aren't going to tell you how to treat this illness or whatever if they don't want to treat it, for example. You don't have to do that, but we can send you home. We don't have to allow you to be here. And that was really about it. Like private businesses still, they cannot refuse service or entry to their facilities to someone, even if they have a case of pink eye or something that's very visible, right? Measles, exactly.
Oh. So Kyle, the governor did not waste much time signing this bill into law. When does it take effect?
Yeah, he worked pretty fast. The law is going to take effect on July 1. So the timeline was pretty fast. The House passed it late Friday afternoon, the last day of the session, about 3 p.m. And then about an hour later, the Senate passed it. And then an hour later, after the Senate passed it, the governor had already signed it into law. And just to be clear, he'd already seen a very similar version of the bill as Jimmy was talking about a week earlier that he vetoed over the concern that schools couldn't send homesick kids. But this bill carves out an exception.
So Kyle, let's talk about the dozen or so other bills, though, that the governor had on his desk last week, because he only has a certain amount of time, right, to sign, to veto, or to do nothing.
Yeah, This was new to me. So typically during the legislative session, he has 5 days besides Sundays to decide what he's going to do with a bill when it gets on his desk. There's kind of an administrative process transmitting the bill to his desk. But once it gets there, he has 5 days. But once the legislature adjourns for the year, sine die is the official Latin term they use.
Mm-hmm.
Once sine die happens, he has 10 days to act on bills. So the
Oh.
deadline for about a dozen bills on his desk is now the last deadline I saw was next Tuesday for a lot of these bills. So he has more time to decide on it. And there are a couple bills that I'm keeping an eye on. One of them, House Bill 109, would make Idaho pursue a ban to ban food stamps from covering candy and soda, but Idaho needs federal approval for that to happen, so it'll probably take more time. And then there's another bill I'm keeping an eye on that's on his desk that he hasn't taken action on yet. Is a bill that would make ivermectin available over the counter in Idaho. That's without any consultation with the doctor or prescription needed. And that's out of about a dozen or so bills he hasn't taken action on yet that are on his desk.
Okay, well, appreciate that update, Kyle. Don, I want to talk about Micron for a minute here. In particular, its DEI policies, because the company has been fairly silent this year as compared to other years. So can you start by telling us about a report that the company has released, right, in the past couple of years, but they did not do that this year?
Yes, every year for the last 6 years, Micron has released what it calls the "What Makes Us Micron" report, where it details its efforts on what it calls diversity, equality, and inclusion. The company has issued a news release about this each and every year, sometimes before the end of the calendar year, sometimes after, but the latest date they had ever issued a news release on that was March 5th. We had noticed that they neither had issued that report nor had they put up the news release. And we asked a Micron spokesperson about 10 days ago a series of questions related to that. Would they be releasing the report? Did they compile the data? And have they made any changes to their DEI policies? The spokesperson said they would get back to us and eventually did, and said that Micron would not be commenting. After we dug in a little bit more on this, we also noticed that the company's page that featured this report had been edited late last year. It previously had a header that said diversity, equality, and inclusion. It now says global culture and workforce. The messaging on the page is still largely the same, including quotes from employees that say that they are happy with Micron's efforts around DEI. But there have obviously been some kind of small edits here. What's interesting is many large companies across the nation have come out and just said, "Hey, we're rolling back our DEI efforts," and they're companies that you're familiar with: McDonald's, Walmart, Meta, Nike, and others. Micron has not done that, but they have kind of made these smaller, more stealth edits.
Well, and Don, I don't want to miss words here because Micron has a lot on the line and they have a lot to lose because President Trump stated that he wants to get rid of the CHIPS Act. This would greatly impact Micron. How would that impact them?
Yeah, the president was very blunt in his joint State of the Union, but they don't call it that. Kyle knows and will tell me if I get it wrong, but essentially the State of the Union. He said very plainly, you should get rid of the CHIPS Act when he was talking to Congress. He also issued an executive order in late March, somewhat quietly. We kind of missed notice on this and didn't see it, but the executive order basically rearranges how the CHIPS Act would be administered. For those who might not know or don't remember, the CHIPS Act is the bipartisan legislation that was passed just about 2 years ago that would funnel money to semiconductor makers for producing semiconductor chips here in the United States. The vast majority of the chips in your cell phones and TVs, cars, dishwashers, etc., are made in other countries, from China to Taiwan to India. The semiconductor was not invented here in Boise, but American production was largely at the plant in Southeast Boise, but over time, companies offshored that production. And so the point of that law was to try and bring some of that production back to the U.S. in a time where global relations have been really fraught. The president has basically said that he doesn't like that approach. He thinks instead of these incentives that the country should instead slap tariffs on the importing of goods, which would encourage manufacturers to do it here in the country. The president has a record of taking action on companies that he sees as having policies on DEI that are inconsistent with what he believes that voters put him into office on. There's been no action against Micron that we're aware of so far. And Micron has gotten some of the CHIPS Act funding. They said in their first quarter report that they received their first payment in the first quarter after they had hit a construction milestone at the Boise plant. But they are hoping to get more than $6 billion total dollars from the federal government for the Boise plant, a new facility in Clay, New York, and then some upgrades to their facility in Virginia. And obviously, President Trump has moved with some swiftness to make changes to things that he previously in the government that he doesn't agree with.
Kyle, Idaho's former U.S. Attorney Josh Hurwitz resigned his position in February, as Kevin Fixler mentioned in the top of our show today. He resigned. It was a political position. He is now with the prosecution's team with the Brian Kohberger case. However, President Trump did need to replace this position. So who is now our U.S. Attorney for Idaho?
Yeah, so Trump is replacing him with Bart Davis. He was the last U.S. Attorney for Idaho. So Bart Davis is a longtime Idaho Republican lawmaker. He was in the Idaho Senate for almost 2 decades before he became Idaho's top federal prosecuting attorney. And it's pretty common for new presidents to replace U.S. district attorneys. When Biden became president, Bart Davis resigned. And now that Trump has become president again, Josh Hurwitz is leaving. And in total, Trump has appointed 4 Idahoans to serve in his administration so far.
All right. Well, appreciate that update, Kyle. So a lot of folks have probably heard Boise was going to get a new flag. Then the renditions came out. And now the city is sticking to the old one. Jimmy, give us some background on what has really become quite the saga, which seemed fairly simple at first, right? Redesign a new flag for the city. What?
Yeah, and I know Dawn's also been following this too.
Brown.
Yeah, exactly. So this all started last week. It was last Thursday, at least when we got the new renderings of the 4 final flags. It had been going on in the background for a few months with the city asking, residents to kind of fill out a survey and give out keywords as to what they thought might represent Boise. And so they focused on a few different things and then put out the call to artists. 116 or so flags were submitted by people. And then they winnowed them down to those 4, which three of them look pretty much the same, at least in shapes and themes, right? And so that was one of the baseline, I guess, comments, if you want to be generous, that you saw on social media. Thousands and thousands of people commenting on every single news outlet's story, saying like, "Why do we need this? These are ugly. How much money was spent on this, et cetera, et cetera." And so Mayor Lauren McLean goes on KTVB on Tuesday morning. And spoke with her former press secretary, Justin Core, and said, hey, we've heard from a passionate, the passion is overwhelming. We hear you, Boise. We're sticking with our flag, which, if anyone doesn't know what it looks like, it is a navy blue background with kind of a rendering of the Idaho Capitol Dome, city of Boise, city of trees.
Okay, so Dawn, as Jimmy mentioned, when the 4 finalists for consideration were released, for the public to vote on, folks had thoughts, lots of thoughts. I'll be completely transparent. I'm in a text group with a group of friends, moms where our kids go to school. We had lots of thoughts in that text string because they're ugly. They're just ugly, and they have nothing to do with Boise. I don't think I'm the only one who felt that way.
That doesn't sound like a question. That sounds like your opinion, Gemma.
Well, it is my opinion. It's my opinion.
I mean,
but
I'm just teasing you. Even on our own staff,
Yeah.
like we had people who liked them and people who had thoughts. And I think what's funny here is, so I opened up the email, and I think Jimmy had a similar process. So I opened up the email on Thursday, and I went, those all look the same. And
That's what I
it
thought.
wasn't about the
Yeah.
design for me. It wasn't about the fact that I can't tell you if they're pretty or ugly or not. I don't know. I've got a bright orange logo, so what do I know? What I noticed is they were also similar, and I actually think that's what a lot of the comments started to center on. And then our Aaron Banks Resby, one of our reporters, was like, that's a syringa. Syringas have 4 flowers. That has 5. And then we noticed that all 4 flags had stars, and they all had the same colors. And so we actually did a public records request, as I think James did, for all of the.
I think Jimmy did too. Yeah.
Submitted designs, and then on Sunday, after this had just been boiling for several days, I went, well, I've got a bunch of questions, and I listed them out for the city. And Monday, I was told we would get an answer after the mayor made a decision Monday afternoon, and that decision was to take the mayor on TV with her former spokesperson, and then we didn't get a news release for several more hours, which was, I think, frustrating for those of us who'd been trying to work on this story. And I've told the city my frustration there, and we'll work it out. But that seemed kind of odd to me, and so the whole process was just a little confusing. And
well, and what's
people like what
interesting,
they
Don,
like.
Yeah, well, but I have to say, I mean, you did put up on BoiseDev.com some of the other flags that were submitted, and looking at them, I'm like, oh, that's a nice one. That's a nice one. And they actually, there's one that has like the Boise Depot on it, right? There's one that has the Capitol on it. Like it actually lets you know that it's Boise. So with all that said, though, do they have any plans to go back to the drawing board, or are they just sticking with the original flag?
I think they've said they're sticking with it. I mean, who knows what happens over time, but for now, I think they're stuck.
They've got other flag problems, as Don knows.
Oh, okay. And I actually thank you, Jimmy, for that segue, because Don, I wanted to bring that up. This has been put to bed. We're staying with the current flag. Tell us about this other kind of, I guess, flag gate issue, because there is a certain flag that is flying outside of City Hall in Boise. Talk to us about this and why the mayor decided to make this decision.
Yeah, I like to think of Boise Dev as a hyper-local news outlet, and this will be the 3rd story we've done in a week on one single flagpole. I'm not kidding. I've gone and stood by this pole a lot. So the Idaho legislature passed, and Governor Little signed a bill that restricted the flags that could fly on government properties. As you know, the city of Boise is a political subdivision of the state of Idaho, and is generally bound by its laws. And they limited what could be flown on government property to the United States flag, the official flag of the government entity, flags of other states, the military branches, the POW/MIA flags, and a couple of other flags. The city has long flown what's called the Progress Pride flag. This is the 5 colors of the gay pride flag with some chevrons for the trans community and people of color. Margaret Carmel, after this bill passed, asked me to go down to City Hall on Monday and see if the flag was still up. It was. We reported that. And then on Wednesday, Channel 6, to its credit, asked the city, and the city said, we're not going to make any changes to the flags on city property. On Thursday, the Idaho Statesman noticed that briefly the flag was down and put back up. So I went over this morning and I looked at the flag, and the flag is very vibrant, and the colors are all really nice. And the photo I have from not that long ago shows that it's a little bit more faded, and there's a small hole in the flag. It appears that the flag has been actually replaced. The city spokesperson says they don't know. They've tried to find it out and don't know, but it looks like they replaced it. As I was speaking to the spokesperson today, she said, and we just put another new flag up. And I literally went, what? And I work about a block from City Hall. I can't see the plaza from my window. You'd think I knew that, but I still tried to get up and look out the window to see it. I walked down the street, and the city has put up another flag. This is for organ donation. I was told that the mayor, I was initially told we would get a statement from the mayor. That has not come, but I'm now told that the mayor will answer questions about this on next Thursday. So we will wait and see and ask the mayor some questions about this flagpole that I spend all of my time and effort on next Thursday, and we'll let you know. One other thing I will tell you. As I was standing below the flag for the 14th time, a Boise police officer walked up and asked me if I was affiliated with a well-known activist linked to sort of the most conservative side of the Republican Party. I said, no, I wasn't, and I had a Boise Dev shirt on. The officer said, oh, okay, well, we're expecting a protest about the flag, and they wanted to be in contact with the organizers. So we may see more here, and we will keep an eye on this for Boise Dev readers and your folks as well.
No, appreciate that. I mean, I did not think that I would spend an entire segment talking about flags, but there we go.
Fun with flags,
With
as Sheldon
said,
Cooper would say.
There you go. I think it's a fair statement to say that public lands are quite sacred here in Idaho and in the West. And now one of our 4 state delegates is speaking out and, in fact, signing onto a bill, to not allow the sale of these lands, right? So can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so you have Congressman Mike Simpson. He's like the second longest serving congressman from Idaho in its history. If you know much about him, big public lands guy, big supporter of, Boulder White Clouds Wilderness, things like that. And he this week signed on to a bill called the Public Lands and Public Hands Act. This is a bill from Montana Representative Ryan Zinke that would basically make it so pretty much all tracts of public land would not be able to be sold by the federal government. It would exclude, I think the limit is like 500 acres or something, so that if easements need to be made with, local communities, that is a possibility, but otherwise largely no. And it's something that a lot of conservation groups cheered this week. I mean, you had all the major ones from Idaho, Idaho Conservation League, Conservation Voters for Idaho, and the Idaho chapter of the Wilderness Society sent out a joint press release cheering the move because they're very concerned that with the new Trump administration, that this idea of selling public lands to help balance the federal budget might actually be in play. And that's something that, other reporters in DC have kind of noticed. E&E News, which is kind of like a trade publication, very, very good at getting scoops in DC, interviewed both the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee and House Ways and Means Committee, which have both kind of floated the idea, early stages. But I mean, just being part of the conversation is extremely troubling to a lot of conservationists and just people in general, especially in the West where most of the federal land is. That's the thing, is that if maybe you lived in the East Coast for most of the time, a lot of that land is private. You don't really see public lands, whereas 63% of Idaho is public, right? So it's a significant issue. Simpson is like the third or fourth person to sign on to this. It was introduced last congressional session by Zinke, didn't really move out of committee. Not really sure what the future holds for it, but Simpson is sort of one of those, maybe quieter, but congressman, but someone who prides himself on getting things done while being in the trenches. So I don't know if maybe he can help it get further along and increase the odds of it moving somewhere. We'll just have to see. It's early days.
All right. Appreciate that update, Jimmy. So, Don, Albertsons is rolling back a really high-profile change it made, about 20 years ago? Talk to us about this decision.
Yeah, this is one of those stories that only I'll do, but I found it interesting, and a lot of people read it. So Albertsons, back in the early 2000s, or in the late 90s, bought a company called American Stores. In the early 2000s, a GE executive by the name of Larry Johnston came on board to be the CEO and cratered the stock price and sold the company in 3 pieces. Before that happened, he made a decision to import an idea from the Chicago area. And that idea was that the stores were branded with Jewel, which was a grocery name, and Osco, which was a drugstore name. So that was rolled out across the company. And you've probably seen this in Boise. If you've ever been at a doctor's office and you use the Albertsons pharmacy, you might have had your provider say, "Hey, can we send this to the Save On Pharmacy on Overland?" And you'll be like, "The what?"
Right.
Oh, Albertsons.
And then you're like, what? No, Albertsons. Right.
What is it? Yeah. And if you've ever looked at a pill bottle from Albertsons, it doesn't say Albertsons. It says Save On Pharmacy. We actually noticed this quite a while ago, but then there was a big, trial involving Albertsons, so we didn't get to it. But we noticed that they started taking the Save On signs down and replacing them with pharmacy. They're doing this slowly as they remodel stores, and they're just going to use the Albertsons brand for the stores and the pharmacies, which is what they used to do. It was interesting digging into this, though, because Larry Johnston, who I think many people in Boise don't love, took credit for the idea and also said that he came up with the term dual branded. And I went, what if that's true? And it's not. It was being used far before 2002 when he told a trade magazine that. So just kind of one last little piece of Larry Johnston's time at Albertsons that is being erased all these years later.
So, John, I just got a couple minutes left, but I do want to talk about this really quickly. And this has to do with the downtown Boise Library. It's closing an entire floor for upwards of a year.
Yeah, they talked about this at the Boise City Council meeting this week. I was there for another reason. Margaret Carmel actually did the reporting on this. And folks will remember that the city wanted to replace this library with a $130 million project. That didn't happen, and voters constrained the city's ability to spend money. The last few years, the city, stuck with a kind of aging building, was like, well, we got to do something here, and has been making some small upgrades. So the last phase of this, and the most visible thing, will be they will close the main floor of the library for a year and completely redo it. There's a rendering up on boisedev.com of this. They'll move the circulation desk, put in new shelves on wheels so they can move it around. The library's tight, and so that helps them to do things. Reorganize the children's section, update HVAC and lighting and some of those things. So the way things will work is when you enter the main library now, if you're familiar, you typically go in through one set of doors, go through a vestibule, and then go into the main area. Off to the right, and I was fascinated by this when I was a kid for reasons unknown. Off to the right, there is a kind of a secret elevator and stairs, and I was always like, "Ooh, what's up the secret elevator and stairs?" That's how you'll get to the second and third floors of the library.
Okay.
So you'll enter the vestibule, you'll hang a right, you'll get in the elevator. They're going to put a focus on children's programming and space up there on the second and third floor because it is a lot less space in this interim period. But yeah, in about a year and a half, because this will start in the fall, the first floor of the Boise Public Library will have an all new look.
Well, Don, you're not the only one who was obsessed with the library when they were a kid. My husband has so many stories about that main library and how obsessed he was with it as a little kid. So something special about that library with an exclamation point on it. I know. All right. Well, so appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy schedules to talk with us. We've been speaking with our very own James Dawson with Boise State Public Radio, Don Day, the founder and editor of BoiseDev.com, Kyle Fonenstill, reporter for Idaho Capital Sun, and Kevin Fixler, investigative reporter with the Idaho Statesman, joined us earlier in the program. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudette.